Hello, everyone, and welcome to the talk is presented by the LGBTQ Ministry at All Saints. My name is Hannah, my pronouns are they, them, and I'm one of the co-leaders of the LGBTQ Ministry. Here our mission statement is to build a safe and diverse community, provide an affirming space to explore both our sexual and gender identities in relation to our faith and other aspects of our identity, and through education and activism, we seek to bring about radical inclusion at All Saints and in the wider world. So as part of our goal of providing education, we've put together this guest speaker series, The Talk, where we invite people from across the LGBTQ community, across the church, and indeed across the country in this time of virtual gathering, so that we can listen to what they have to say and learn from the huge amount of knowledge, experience, and wisdom that we have within our community. So I'm going to hand over to my co-lead Thomas, who's going to introduce himself and our speaker and the rest of the evening.
Awesome. Hello, everybody. My name is Thomas Diaz. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the other co-leader here for LGBTQ Ministry at All Saints Church. We have a special guest with us this evening in what is the final stretch of the election season, and that is Alan Yarborough, who is the Church Relations Officer for the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations. Alan helps manage grassroots advocacy and engaging through the church and develops resources aimed at educating and equipping its members in policy advocacy. And we feel this is such a fitting time as we're just days in before the election season ends. And so, Ellen, we thank you for being with us, and I hand it over to you and to inspire us about all things church relations with government relations in the Episcopal Church.
Yeah, thank you both very much for the invitation to speak with you all this evening. And it is, a fascinating time to be involved in this work. And I think we have there's a lot of attention, to government involvement during election cycles. And I think maybe more particularly this one. We'll have to maybe wait until election day to see how big the voter turnout is. But, it does seem like turnout is increasing for early voting, for mail-in voting. And there just seems to be a really good response overall to civic participation. So capturing, on that energy, I think in this moment is really an opportunity to remind everybody, that we need to stay involved in this work year round. And so I'm hoping that what, I share this evening and our conversation this evening can help provide you all tools and connections within the Episcopal Church to continue that work yourself, and to know that there is a church office and there are church organizations out there who are representing Episcopalians in Washington, D.C. To the U.S. government. So before kind of getting into the office, maybe I'll just briefly talk about myself for a moment so you can get to know me a bit. I grew up in North Carolina. I'm the only member of my family, I think right now, that is living outside of the Carolinas. And I'm up in Maryland, just outside of the D.C. area. So East Coast, born and raised, but have had the privilege of traveling and living in a number of places. I worked in Haiti for the Episcopal Church through the Young Adult Service Corps program, which is a great program. If you have not heard of it, I encourage you to check that out. Places young adults outside of their home country for a year of service and a number of different environments. Looks a little bit different in the moment, given the current pandemic, but it's still an amazing program, amazing opportunity. So from there, ended up in the Office of Government Relations for the Episcopal Church, which has been a part of the church-wide staff since the late 70s. And it's based in Washington, D.C., and it's tasked with being the voice of the church to the U.S. federal government. It's really one of many faith-based advocacy offices that are here. Most mainline Christian denominations and other faith groups have advocacy offices in D.C. doing this similar work, and we collaborate with a lot of them on a number of different issues. Sometimes if We may not be in agreement on all issues, but there are areas of overlap, and we feel like we can partner on a particular issue, then we will do so. And I think the nature of advocacy itself is an interesting one because it requires a lot of patience and a lot of relationship building. And certainly other means of engagement do as well. But there's not necessarily this, I don't think there's as immediate of a reward in the act of advocacy. There is, one way to kind of think about advocacy, comparing it to activism or protesting, is to think of them as parallel tracks of engagement. And we think of advocacy and protesting, like perhaps what we've seen this summer in Black Lives Matter protests across the country. Those are necessary for movement building, for public awareness, for just mobilizing people and building energy up. But the aspirations, the goals that are sort of outlined in some of those movements ultimately have to be then articulated in a much greater detail in policy and legislation, whether that's at the state and local level or the federal level in Congress. And so the advocacy piece really is about that next step. How do we get this get more specific, get into the details where there's going to be more disagreement, there's going to be less clarity about the right way to actually achieve something, even if we know what we want to achieve, we know what the end goal is. The way to get there is going to be unclear. It's not a neutral environment. There are actors out there, that have different interests. Sometimes they're opposing interests. Sometimes they're ones that, issues just take precedent over others, or get sort of overshadowed sometimes. But navigating that environment is sort of what our office is about, both our staff, representing the church there, but equipping Episcopalians as well. There are a number of reasons why we think we should do this work. The first, being Scripture and inspiration from the Old Testament, from the Gospels. It's sort of all throughout, and using our voice to speak to power and speak out for those who are underserved, those who are outcast, to speak out with them as well. So making sure that platforms are shared, and it's not just we're taking the place of someone else, but it's working alongside people as we pursue justice through better policy and better legislation. Two other reasons to do this, one would be scale. And for the federal government advocacy, which we focus on, the federal government just can have a scale of impact that no other entity can have. And so if we want to address hunger, for example, 95% of domestic food assistance comes from the federal government. And the other 5% comes from all charitable organizations. So that's churches and secular organizations. Great work, that work is necessary, but the scale is just radically different. And so to influence federal legislation becomes really important in addressing food insecurity or any number of issues. And then the third issue, which I find the most fascinating for federal advocacy, is the issue of authority. And so the federal government has authority over certain issues that no other entity has. And so if we want to have an influence in those spaces, that's who we have to interact with. Three different examples would be immigration or refugee resettlement policies. So there is a sanctuary movement, and I know All Saints has been involved in that. That's helpful. There's good in that, and in a sense, that's like a band-aid for what's ultimately a policy problem that can be addressed through better legislation. And so it's got to be both and. How are we tending to the now? How are we addressing it through policy and legislation? We could not resettle refugees independently as the Episcopal Church through our Refugee Resettlement Agency without government approval. Two other examples in terms of authority, foreign policy. A lot of our foreign policy engagement, war, that sort of thing, which we don't necessarily like to talk about, but it's very much a justice issue, and is something that we have to engage the federal government on. And the third thing would be federal protections for various groups, which I know are on a lot of people's minds in the LGBTQ community or communities right now. And the federal government is the place to interact. It's the touch point in order to have ultimate influence in achieving equality under the law and equality and representation. And so that's, drives or motivates us to do this work. The policies that we represent, getting a little church nerdy here, but they all come from General Convention and Executive Council. So they're the elected bodies of the church. They don't come from myself or from the people in our office. We're just tasked to represent those. And so there's decades of just amazing body of resolutions on dozens of topics that the church has deliberated over that have ultimately passed our church leadership, elected church leadership, and then become our own organizational or institutional policies that we can use to influence decision makers in DC. So it's really cool work. We try to engage in strategic ways, which often means compromising. It means taking smaller steps when we think we can get them. It means maintaining relationships with folks who we may have disagreements with, but they're in a position of power, and ultimately we want to try to influence them and work with them to guide their work in the direction that we want to go. And so we look for the effective ways to do that, and that often can look very different from the protesting and the activist movement on the streets, but they can work together. So it's not that one is better than the other, it's just different work. And so I get excited about this because it's just, I don't know, have a knack and a passion for talking through disagreement. And so I like to get into those details. Whereas, protesting and marching is something that seems more foreign to me. And so, I love seeing that energy and seeing that movement, but that's not where I have found my particular space in the overall justice work. So in terms of getting involved, maybe this is the last thing, and then I'll see if you'll have switched the conversation. In terms of getting involved, we run something called the Episcopal Public Policy Network. That's our grassroots network for engaging Episcopalians in this work. You can get email lists where we send our action alerts out, which are specific calls to write Congress usually, although it's sometimes other entities in the government as well, on specific issues. We have pre-drafted letters, and you may be familiar with those from other organizations. But it's an easy way to start your advocacy efforts and building relationships with elected officials. And we try to be strategic with those and sending those calls to action when it seems like there's an opportunity to influence something. And we also do them and work on them in coalition with the other faith groups that I mentioned. So it's not only, in speaking out through that, not only are you speaking out with other Episcopalians across the country, but you're speaking out with other faith groups as well, really adding your voice to hopefully a powerful, movement and the process of petitioning our government. And we're also on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at the EPPN, which is another way to stay in touch with us, get updates on educational resources, civic engagement. We've been doing a lot of election engagement as well. 2020 census work, our civil discourse material as well, is kind of all put out through those various channels. So we'd love to have you all join and be a part of that work. So I'll stop there, sort of a brief overview of the office, and see where you all want to take the conversation this evening.
No, that's great. Thanks, Alan, for that. You brought up something that I've been hearing recently, and I'm very much a person who more resonates with being on the streets, protesting, in front of federal buildings. And one thing that I've noticed, most liberating organizations like Black Lives Matter, for example, they've been saying in the past couple of months that protesting is just one tool in the toolbox, and that it doesn't end there, that there's much more that you would have to do. And when I first heard that, actually for the first time, just a couple of months ago, I was like, yeah, you're right. Because I think there is a sense when there's something either very tragic that we're, witnessing together on the news or media, or we're hearing about a, policy like, children, at the borders being locked in cages. I think there's this human side of us thinking we just have to go out and do something. And, and more majority see folks with posters and thinking that chanting and being out there is doing something. But as you mentioned that, but there also is that policy side that we have to pay attention to. So I guess the question is, how can folks, besides, EPN and doing that work, but, just getting motivated. And I think there's that part that maybe even I can, be honest about, is there's this kind of part of myself like, I'm not sure if I'm equipped to do that. But yet we're seeing that that's such an important key, depending where, the outcome of the election is, that's just, there's an importance to do that, to work for policy. What are some motivations that you think that are out there to get people to
Sure.
do that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of it is it's starting small and just taking off bite-sized pieces. So starting with easier advocacy actions. And I think our emails, which are helpful, they're effective in advocacy, they're really fairly simple. I mean, they should be, less than 5 minutes. You can go in, read it, add your own personal story and hit send. Like it's very simple and easy to use. And so that's a place to get, to just like dip your toe in the water in advocacy. And another way to kind of get to ease in, because I think folks can sometimes be intimidated if they think, oh gosh, I don't know enough on this topic to be influential, is to really reflect not just personally, but maybe in communities that you're in, what particular value adds or interests you already have. So I know it can be challenging. It seems, there are a lot of competing issues, a lot of things that have to be addressed, and they all seem quite urgent. And I'm not questioning the urgency of any of them. But what I'm saying is, how can we be more strategic in addressing them? And I think one of those is to say, rather than jumping around from one to the other, if we say, where can we ourselves be uniquely influential in something? And then start from that place, so that you have a little more sure footing, and can then start to look at different advocacy avenues and advocacy tools at your disposal, whether that's looking at city councils and engaging your city council more, or looking at state government, if that is the level of government that has control over the change that you want to see. So an example, for our federal level work, perhaps, would be a lot of our foreign policy and international work, with U.S. federal agencies. So it's usually policy driven rather than legislative, but the Episcopal Church is present in 17 nations, and we're part of the Anglican Communion, which is the third largest church in the world. And we have churches or relationships in countries, on all the continents, and are able to bring voices from those places into policy conversations in DC in a way that other faith groups are not as equipped to do. And so that's a unique space. It's not going to be one that is necessarily newsworthy or catchy or the largest topic of the day, but it's where we can have a unique value add. And so we lean into that more, perhaps, than we would healthcare advocacy. Even though healthcare advocacy is important, we still engage in that. The Episcopal Church isn't necessarily, at our level, isn't necessarily going to have a value add there. So looking at All Saints, what are the outreach ministries that you have? And maybe it's let me ask, what are some of the outreach ministries that you all have at All Saints?
One of the things that I know that really became such a unique part for All Saints is during the ICE raids in 2017 that happened in LA. And that's when, our rector, Reverend Mike Kimmin, wanted to make our space a sanctuary space. And, and that was a rush to get vestry, approve that and get that going. And, I think that was the first time, and I was still brand new at All Saints. But I recall, that was the first time I think our parishioners really felt like, I don't think I knew enough about this. Why are we becoming a sanctuary church? And, and the LA Times picked it up and all of that. And I, being now almost 2 or 3 years later after that, I think now there's this sense of, unfortunately before COVID, but there was this sense that, we're probably not doing enough as individuals in this movement, and needing to know what that means when we declare that All Saints Church is a sanctuary church, or what it means to have Black Lives Matter banner on our lawn. It's still there. And then yet, we have outreaches, we have our foster program that really helps, individuals to be able to foster children here in the greater LA area. And, and there is a list of more that, I can't think of the top of my head, but I bring that up because I think it's moments like that we've witnessed this past year in particular that we see folks that may not have recognized that these things are out there and that maybe your parish actually supports and needs your help to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so those activities, I imagine have some sort of goal in mind. It's some sort of ministry. It's to make sure you're equipped to provide shelter to people if necessary, to provide them food and water, or with the foster program, making sure you're engaged in the sort of the logistics, the functioning of that program and connecting people together. But there's a policy framework and a legal framework that ties into those issues as well, and you can address those same goals through policy. It's not a replacement for that tangible work at all, but it's something that you can both weave into that tangible work, and you can leverage that tangible experience in the advocacy communication. So you have a wealth of stories and experiences available that can make your case more compelling when you speak to, for example, members of Congress about asylum and deportation and immigration policies. It makes it more personal. It shows that you're invested. And so there's a way that these, for going back to tying it back around to the question, if you're nervous and anxious about getting involved in advocacy, that's I think a window that can be helpful for folks to get involved and to not be overly concerned at first about just the immense number of problems that we could be addressing, and really figure out how to focus your time in a way where, again, you can be uniquely influential.
So one of the things for me that I find as a non-US citizen living in the US and wanting to be involved and engaged still is I find myself often writing letters to say our Congressperson Judy Chu and other kind of political figures I'm aware of, I guess, because that is one way that my voice can be heard aside from voting. Are there other ways, kind of other strategies you'd recommend for people who maybe in the situation where they can't vote but still want to be involved and be helpful?
Sure. Yeah, I think advocacy, one of our sort of underlying, I'm not sure what the right word is to use, underlying components of our advocacy approach is to not just want people to be blindly advocating, but to be informed about what they're advocating on. And so advocacy, in a sense, you can expand it in different ways, and there's overlap with activism, especially in the area of just education and having conversations about particular topics to make sure people are informed. Why are we going to be a sanctuary parish, and what does it mean to go out of business in being a sanctuary parish? How do we not? The goal is going to be, we don't want to be a sanctuary parish anymore because it's not going to be necessary. And so how do we have this whole conversation, and how do we get there? And I think, there's a lot of components to that, and a lot of gifts that people can bring to make something like that happen, whether that's graphic design and communication and publicizing an event, or doing the research and being a teacher on a particular topic in your community. So, advocacy includes, in my opinion, includes all of those components as well, that ultimately leads and equips people to taking action to their elected officials, especially if they're in a position, unlike you are here at least, and if they're in a position to vote and then hold those elected officials accountable. Because it is true, elected officials will respond, to people who are their constituents more so than they will to others, because that's who they're elected to represent. So that's sort of the functioning of the government, but there are a lot of other ways for people to get involved. And I say the same thing for election engagement too, for people who are not eligible to vote for one reason or another. So it could be nationality, it could be age, it could be any number of reasons, but they can still participate in voter education efforts and conversations about the importance of voting. They can still provide support services. So one of the things we've been publicizing lately has been, what is blanking on the Twitter account name? It's basically an initiative to deliver pizzas to polling sites that have really long lines, because I mean, people are in these lines for hours. And so if they didn't bring their own food, they really may be getting hungry, and we don't want that to be a deterrent to casting their vote. And so people are actually delivering food. So there are different ways to get involved. Like, you don't have to have the power to vote to do that, but that is can be part of a part of our democracy and a part of what we're doing.
So, you mentioned about how having to, build relationships with those who might have an opposing view on a particular, agenda. And when you mentioned that, I was thinking, that must be such a challenge at a time when things are so, polarized and it seems to be going in many different directions than it, but probably shouldn't be going. But this is, from at least from the Episcopal side, we are on a mission, and our gospels that lead that, right, to liberation, and freeing all those who are oppressed. So I guess one of the things that, when you said that, I think about, when, Jesus says you kind of have to take your cross and follow me. And, I think that there are times for myself when, I run into disagreements, even just with friends or family, and trying to get, see where the agenda is going, where I'm just like, I don't know if I can do that. because I think there's this sense of yourself, like when you find something so appalling that you're like, no, why are you thinking this way? But we know that on the other end of it, of just having human connection and human relation, that unless you have that rapport with someone, they might not even know that they're even particularly on that case of the agenda, the way they're going with it. So I think as as Episcopalians and as people who are trying to follow Jesus, how do we maintain those relationships? What do we do besides obviously loving thy neighbor, which is the most important key component to that. But when it really comes down to the nitty gritty policy, lawmaking at its core, how do we do that?
Yeah, that's one of the core challenging questions, right? And I guess I want to answer it in two different ways. Maybe the first from sort of an institutional perspective, and kind of how our office approaches that, in leading the Episcopal Church and the broader advocacy space, and then maybe on an individual level, because I think our tools that are designed to help people at the individual level draw inspiration from our experience at that institutional level. So I mentioned we work with a lot of faith-based advocacy offices, and it may be of no surprise to all, or certainly isn't to myself, growing up as a gay person in the Carolinas, very conservative Christian area, that all of those faith groups are not in agreement with the Episcopal Church on 100% of the issues that we work on. But we still strive to work with organizations where it makes sense to do so. So it may mean that we only work on one issue with another organization while we don't, we're addressing other issues that we're not in agreement on and through other means. So an example might be, we've done a lot of immigration work with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. They've done some amazing work around immigration policy in a number of different ways and have been a great voice on that. We've also worked with the Southern Baptist Convention's advocacy office on a number of fronts, in particular on criminal justice reform, a couple of international issues, and yet, in some of these relationships, we may not be able to address LGBT rights, for example. But that doesn't mean, because we're in a relationship with those organizations working on certain issues, that we're suddenly ignoring or not wanting to engage any of those others. It's just simply saying, we can be in a relationship on this, and we want to emphasize that relationship because it's strategic, it's in both of our interests, we can work together and make progress here, recognizing that both of us, both organizations, are also working in other ways on other topics. And so I think that I've actually found that rather than it being difficult, I think I've found it more inspirational and reassuring over the past 4 years to have those curious, sometimes creative and unexpected collaborations with organizations that I think in public rhetoric and maybe the public mind, then we think, oh, they're going to be so opposed, they're never going to work together, but we're still able to find a way to work together on something. And I think that's really beautiful. It does, present certain challenges along the way, certainly. But I think having those relationships really have been some of the more fruitful and genuine feeling ones that I've had in the work over the past 4 years that I've been with the office. And so we've channeled that that work of having to navigate different types of conversations, not having even within that agreement, there's disagreement sometimes over how to talk about an issue. An example that to me comes to mind most easily is, do you say undocumented immigrant or do you say illegal alien? I mean, I personally would never use that term. The Episcopal Church does not use the term illegal alien. But for some audiences, if that term's not used, the deeper meaning behind an immigration policy is just going to be lost. The conversation is not going to move forward. So how, if you're in a position of leadership, do you then message about the importance of a proper asylum system, the importance of a stronger refugee resettlement program if you're using terms that are going to lose your audience? That's a really big challenge. And so even when there's ways that we collaborate, there's going to be disagreement, and sometimes it's in method like that. Distilling all of that down, we created a civil discourse curriculum to help people in these conversations, to really help folks take a step back and reflect on how we talk to one another rather than jumping right into a particular issue. Because I think we're really losing that skill to speak to one another in deeper and more detailed ways. And we have separated very intentionally in that curriculum, we've separated civil discourse away from the concept of civility overall, because we think it's two different things. So we define civil discourse as conversation to enhance understanding, and emphasize that it is about this dynamic between people who want to be in a relationship, emphasizing curiosity, emphasizing questioning of other people. Why is it what leads you to believe this, or why is it you think this way, and having a genuine curiosity about hearing that. And then in sharing your own perspectives, having the humility that we may not know everything of on a given topic. And both of those tools, along with others that we discussed in the curriculum, can be really helpful to unlocking some of these interpersonal dynamics. And I think most illuminating through that, hopefully, although I recognize for those that are in an oppressed community, it feels familiar and is familiar. I recognize it as a struggle to have to explain oneself in a sense. But I think that process can rehumanize people in both directions. When you're opening up conversation that's more genuine, that's deeper, that recognizes that when we're discussing something political, it's not happening to people who are over there, it's happening to people right here. And it's going to be painful for us to talk about those issues. And it may be that it's LGBT rights, it may be something we're not even aware of. That we don't know about each other. And that's the reason why it's difficult for us to talk about a topic. And so civil discourse, I think, really can help, it helps us break through those barriers. It helps us to remember that our identities shouldn't be rooted so deeply in our political identity, and that they're a lot more complex than that. And I think that's something that frankly, both main sides of the political aisle need to hear, in my experience. It's not something that's limited to the left or the right, and it's a challenging thing to do.
So I'm really curious, what does a typical day or maybe a typical week look like in the Government Relations Office? And does that change on the run up to the election?
Whew, goodness, it feels, most of my experience here has been under the current presidential administration. And it has been bizarre. But I don't necessarily have a point of reference for it. So speaking to people who have been in this longer, it's bizarre. It's very abnormal, and it's kind of changed in its abnormalities over the course of the 4 years, from sort of a period of chaos and not necessarily even knowing who we're supposed to direct an inquiry to, for example, or who's in charge of something, to some general frustration about just lack of movement, in particular in Congress, if anything. substantial, mostly in the Senate. The House has passed some pretty historic bills, including the Equality Act, which is notable to have that type of bill pass a chamber of Congress. That's not something to overlook and I think take lightly, even though it hasn't gone farther. That was an important step. And so day to day, most of the time, we're trying to be strategic and knowing that we have dozens of issues that the church has policy on, and we're trying to represent those. We want to line up the tools, or the advocacy tools that we have, the chances that we think we can have a particular influence on a topic with those different policy areas, and then try to just make strategic decisions on where we should be spending our time. So if it's healthcare, how do we get a quick message out and say people need to call, like this is the best way to be effective. We've done some work like the affordable, ACA or Obamacare for the Affordable Care Act. We did some advertising as a nonprofit for the open enrollment period because the government cut the funding for marketing for that. So there are different ways that we can get involved in that way. And that's constantly changing. It's going to depend on where legislation is moving in Congress. It's going to depend on what policy issues might be coming up in federal agencies. And so we're trying to keep a lookout for that all the time. One of the benefits, going back to the previous question, of having lots of different faith partners, and as many as we can, means there are that many more eyes that we're connected to who are watching legislation move and policies change. And so even though our office, which is quite small, it's like four and a half staff roughly, even though we're quite small, we can rely on other offices' expertise. And so that helps our day-to-day kind of move and helps us to cover more topics than maybe we would otherwise. So that's kind of the day-to-day under normal circumstances. Now it does seem like it's mostly all election engagement. And that's just, it's putting it simply, it's how do we encourage people to vote? And it's all nonpartisan work. So it's not supporting or denouncing a political candidate or political party and their capacity running for office. It's all just simply voter participation. So it's messaging on the process and educating people what to expect. What does this mean? How do we break through some of the misinformation and the news that might be misleading? We want to acknowledge and address voter suppression, certainly. But usually, other than, of course, through the act of voting, it's not the time to actually address voter suppression to an extent. That's going to happen throughout the course of the year when different states pass different laws. So the biggest issue statistically is apathy and thinking that people's vote doesn't matter. And so we really put our energy into just building excitement and connecting people to the tools and resources they need to cast their vote and to try to convince them that it does matter to vote in each election. The presidential one certainly takes the spotlight, but it is not only a presidential election. It is a nationwide election all the way down, it's called down the ballot, or down to state and local level races. And so I know folks sometimes don't cast their vote because they don't like either of the presidential options, but to me, that's not, you're then sort of ignoring and overlooking all of the other races that you have the power to speak out on. And in some states, they're ballot measures. I think California allows those. So there are ballot measures that you can actually vote on specific policies that are at play on the ballot itself. So that's the main thing for election engagement. It's been a little more chaotic this time around than the past two cycles, I think, because of misinformation and a lot of anxiety leading up to the election. So it feels like while we have this sort of, there's work, we know how to move forward, the election engagement piece, we're also kind of like blocking out different messages that we don't want to get through and that we try not to, we need to address, we try not to give more bandwidth than they deserve because it is to an extent distracting, not representative statistically of what's going on. It might be an anomaly, it might be a serious issue, but just because it's happening in one place doesn't mean it's suddenly a problem nationwide. And so we've got to make sure we have confidence, maintain confidence in the system in that way to the extent that we can, because overall the election system is working very well. And there are a lot of positive signs to how the election process is going, despite some of the complications, not just from the political environment, but from the pandemic perspective as well. It's actually been impressive to see how some of the states have stepped up. and made adjustments to see how people have stepped up to be poll workers. I think I just saw that Ohio reached its requirement for the number of poll workers that they wanted for all of their polling sites, which is amazing. I'm happy to get into that more detail if you want, but yeah.
No, that's just great, and I think that's a great way to kind of wrap things up, as you know, we're just a few more days remaining in this election season, and the importance of voting, and and really getting the encouragement that at times, it seems that the spotlight's only for the presidential general election, but there's so much more that folks can have power in. Especially like you mentioned in California, propositions are everything at the moment, and and it always increases. I've seen, in the past years, and so that's just such a beauty of our freedoms, in this country, that we get to vote that in. And like district attorney is another one, and all these other sorts of roles that you can find in your local and state level. So that's an importance of that.
Tell me about the sticker you're wearing. I love the sticker you're wearing.
Yes, and I was, that actually was going to be a segue. I was going to say, Ellen, that and I don't know if I can really zoom in, but tell folks how they can get this really cool. I'm an Episcopalian, and I voted, and I did.
Yeah.
So what's it all about?
Awesome. Yes, we've been promoting this. I mean, for folks who have voted before, or maybe you just have seen it. Usually, when you vote, you get an "I voted" sticker. Different states have different designs, and so we created one for the Episcopal Church for Episcopalians. Once they have voted, they can wear it. So you can reach out to our office. I think we can include the email, hopefully, like in the description, maybe of the video would be the easiest way. But reach out if you would like a sticker. At this point, I don't know for mailing how quickly we can get them out, but we can do as quickly as possible. We can mail a sticker. We also have some magnets left, the same design, but they're just a little bit larger. So we have some magnets left, English and Spanish, if you're interested in Spanish ones as well.
That's awesome.
Amazing.
Great.
And where can we find the Government Relations Office, or indeed you, on social media? Or elsewhere on the internet?
Yeah, so the tag is at the EPPN, so that's THEEPPN, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. That's probably the quickest way to get involved, but we also have a website, which again, maybe including in the description will work. We've got our website and the email sign up list, or the sign up for our email list as well.
Thank you.
Great. Well, Ellen, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. I think you have even regenerated more for the election season, and myself, and I know that folks who will get that from that. And I thought it's a way to end, as there's much anxiety and just different mixed emotions going into the end of the election season on Tuesday. Another neat thing that you can find on these social media platforms from the government relations is just really great prayers, and they're just coming out like crazy, which is fantastic. It's just wonderful. It seems like there's a post every day of just a prayer, and there's, I believe, a 9-day prayer also happening as well, which I'm actually doing
Nice.
in the morning and the evening. So I thought a way to end would be just to pray one of the prayers of the faithful that you had posted, and folks can find out on Instagram and on Facebook. So we will pray that, and let's see, I guess, Alan, if you want, you can just do the prayer part, and I'll do I can do the intercessor and the people part.
It sounds great.
That sounds good. All right. Go ahead.
Yeah. Loving God, creator of this world, who is the source of our wisdom and understanding, watch over this nation during this time of election. Help us to see how our faith informs our principles and actions.
Dios creador nuestro, guíanos en la vida, en el amor.
We give thanks for the right to vote. Help us to hold this privilege and responsibility with care and awareness it merits, realizing that our vote matters and that it is an act of faith.
God of our Creator, guide us in truth and love.
Guide us through this election as a nation, state, and community as we vote for people to do work on our behalf and on behalf of our communities. Help us to vote for people and ballot initiatives that will better our community and our world so that it may reflect the values Christ taught us.
Dios credo nuestro, guíanos en la vida en el amor.
Help us create communities that will build your kingdom here on earth, communities that will protect the poor, stand up for the vulnerable, advocate for those who are not seen and heard, and listen to everyone's voice.
God our Creator, guide us in truth and love.
We pray for this nation that is deeply divided. May we come together for the common good and do as you have called us to do, to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with you through creation.
Dios credo nuestro, guíanos en la vida en amor.
Help us act out of love, mercy, and justice, rather than out of arrogance or fear.
God our Creator, guide us in truth and love.
Lord, continue to guide us as we work for the welfare of this world. We pray for places that are torn by violence, that they may know peace.
God our Creator, guide us in truth and love.
We pray for communities who are struggling with inequality, unrest, and fear. May we all work toward reconciliation with one another and with God.
Dios credo nuestro, guíanos en la vida en el amor.
Help us to listen and love, work together in peace, and collaborate with one another as we seek the betterment of our community and world.
God our Creator, guide us in truth and love. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
So-